Here, I want to talk about how things changed over the decades. This young lady, Roy Deschanel, is talking, or Bromy, or however it's spelled, is talking about the 1980s. This is a very poignant film, The Breakfast Club. I was a young guy in the 80s. And she's going to get some things wrong because she's going to bring up what came before this and what it made it happen, right? So let's get to it.
Relationship with your parents to the painstaking, earth-shattering crushes. The 1980s came in the wake of a sexual revolution that had occurred in the decades prior, the 1960s and 70s, where second-wave feminism was being increasingly absorbed into the North American vernacular, and women marched the streets demanding their sexual freedom. But when Reagan assumed power in 1981, reacting to what conservatives at the time viewed as a moral degradation of American society, his administration represented a desire to reinstate a traditional vision of the nuclear family and reinforce women's roles within the private sphere.
Wrong. This was not caused by Reagan in any way. The common woman on the street demanded the status quo. Deschanel. I'm going to repeat that. The average woman wanted. What happened was that the sexual revolution, as was pointed out earlier videos of mine, didn't come along till the contraception pill came along in the early 60s. And that's what gave women their freedom. And that generation never had, or any generation before that, as far as that goes, had that kind of freedom. So those women were kicking their heels up. But if you were a girl who was like 7-year-old in 1961, by the time, your turn came along, by the time you reached, let's say, 16 or 17, you took all that for granted. You took that freedom for granted. And so the next generation quickly demanded the status quo. They wanted men to go back to pandering to them for their sex and their attention. That's what happened. Look at John Travolta here in Saturday Night Fever in the late 70s. He's all about making himself physically beautiful. The great hair, the great shape, the stylish clothing, everything. But then, check this out. Robert Palmer in the 1980s. What's he wearing? He's got the suit and tie, right? The suit signals wealth and status. So whereas John Travolta was showing him off physical sexuality, by the time the 80s came around, these guys were now back to the suits and ties. They weren't showing off their bodies. They were showing off the status, whether they had it or not. So that's what's going on here. This has nothing to do with Reagan. Reagan may wanted it to be like that, but he didn't cause it. The very fact that they wanted marriage to remain stable is that guys want a woman to revolve their lives around, and they couldn't get it because of the sexual revolution, which was really a financial revolution. Women were getting their own jobs. Now that life was getting easy and safe, and the job market was theirs, they didn't want the guys around. They said, sorry, you're not making enough money to pay for my sex and my time. That's what happened. After all, do you remember, here's an 80s film, Weird Science. What is Weird Science all about? These two young guys who create accidentally a beautiful woman who doesn't really behave like a regular woman. She's the Nawal. Not all women are like that. She's the dream girl fantasy, right? She comes and supports these young guys. She's gorgeous. She's there for them. That's what the American dream was in the 1980s. What was Revenge of the Nerds about? It's the same thing. These guys are low status men. They can't get girlfriends because they're low status. And so the whole film is about them getting the girl at the end. You didn't see films, at least not to the same degree and number in the 70s and 60s as you did in the 80s, because guys who were young in the 80s, they grew up in the 60s and 70s. You know, like say, if you were a 7-year-old boy, by the time you were 17, you were getting deselected. It wasn't Saturday Night Fever for them. And so anyone who created these films, they would have grown up in that era and found out what it was like. So the movies during the 60s and 70s were not depicting the reality of the generation that was growing up in them. Now, some of the guys in the collective, they did disagree with me about the suit, because they said, look, they're very pragmatic. They said the suit might have just been, you know, like a change of fashion. Fashions go in and out, but the suit has never disappeared. I don't think it's an accident at all, any more than you see this change of films. And so, young woman, what's your name again? Broy. Okay, Broy Deschanel. That's what it is. You are wrong. You were wrong about feminism. You were wrong about Reagan. You were just plain out wrong. Matter of fact, and the reason why I need to make this video is that men have been gaslighted enough. I'm sure you're not lying in the way that you believe what you're saying is true. I'm just telling you what you're saying is not true. It's not true. These women were enjoying their ride for the time, but anyone 10 years younger than them, any girl, they didn't enjoy this. They took it for granted, and they went back to wanting guys signaling their status. That's how it went. Broy Deschanel. Thank you. I think that's all we need to say about this.